The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
All right, so we're going to continue now and kind of get into the examples part of the course. And again, this is really the part that people should really, I strongly encourage people doing the examples. How many people got a chance to try the examples in the? Very good. And we got a couple of questions for people, and most of the time we got another email from them right away that said, "Oops, nope, got it to work." So we're very pleased about that. The great thing about working at Lincoln Labs is people are pretty good at figuring stuff out. We have some experience this before. Obviously, our parallel Matlab technology, we've released that out. Many people use it, and for the most part, we're proud to say that whenever we get a question from the outside world and it's not working, it's usually the person has taken severely active steps to ignore the documentation, but if they follow it at all, they're generally pretty safe. So I'm going to get into the example code here. So the example code, this is, that's not D4M user share, that's incorrect. It's tools, lowercase examples. I should correct these slides. Okay. Oh, nice. There we go. Great. That is an X, right? Oops. Oh, yes. Thank you. Great. All right. So this is where the example code is. So we're going to go over here. Your assignment, should you choose to undertake it, is to pick a picture. Hopefully someone that's interesting to you. It doesn't have to be straight lines. It could be anything where you could create, draw edges or something. You could take some photo and put it through one of those Photoshop-y effects and turn it into a line drawing or something, and then start labeling vertices. You do want to limit the number of lines, though. I would recommend 20 would be the most number of lines you do, because this can get fairly involved. You might start with something fairly small. So select a picture, label the edges and vertices, create an incidence matrix, okay? And then just compute the adjacency matrix from the incidence matrix using this formula. You can certainly use D4M if you want to do that, but it's fine to do it by hand. It's fine to do it by hand. Just in which case you would want to do a very small one. Just, doing it once by hand is useful. Twice marginally, and then the third time not useful. But just like in high school, right? They make you do matrix multiply by hand, like actually a lot, a lot. So that's the example and the assignment. If you do this on a piece of paper and scan it and email it to me before the next lecture, I will give you some feedback on it before the following lecture. So, if you scan it, give it to me after that, too bad, right? No, I just won't give you feedback, So there's no credit, but this gives you some incentive to get it done. If you want feedback from me about, what you did make sense, or if you encountered, like, I picked this picture and now I don't understand, I did my best, but I have questions about how I did this, does it make sense? I'd be happy to do that. So just scan it, email it to me, or if it is electronic format, you can do that as well. So the lecture portion, and now go back here, and let's see here, we go to examples. All right. So we're in the intro, the Edge Art directory, start my Matlab shell, Right, in the right place. Matlab. It takes about 15 seconds for it to do this. This particular thing always CDs me to the location of the directory. You need to do that in order to see the examples. I think most Matlab users are familiar with that, but just some that are not. Let me hide that. Here is the actual adjacency matrix of that painting. So there it is. Same thing we just saw. So this is the data set that we're going to work with here. All right. So I'm going to do EA1. Again, the numbered one, the courses, all the examples are numbered in order, kind of that you're supposed to proceed through them. And if you see kind of a file in a directory that's like couple capital letters, which are the first two letters of the directory, or the abbreviation of the directory, and a test, that is the examples. The other files are just supporting files. You aren't expected to run those. Try running them, but they'll probably cause you problems if you run them by themselves. All right, here we go. So we just ran that example. Let's see what we got. And let me make this a little bit smaller, a bit bigger. A little bit. All right, I think that worked. All right, so first thing we did here is we read in our data. So we have this read CSV, very useful function. Not necessarily the fastest. In some of the later examples, we have a sort of a super fast reader which does almost no formatting for you. It sort of just reads into triples as raw triples. Because a lot of times if you're reading a very large CSV file, you may not want to construct the full associative array out of the way we would just sort of do it by default. And you can just read in the triples very quickly and then do some manipulations. Or a lot of times the first thing you'll do is create an associative array and then get the triples out of it because you want to work on the triples directly. And so we do have ways for doing that. So this is the, we now created the incidence matrix into an associative array. And let me go down here. Let me just show you that. So if I go disp E, so that shows you the incidence matrix. These are its internal structures here. These are the row keys. So those are recall the labels of the edges. They have been converted to lexicographically sorted order. We have the column keys, but there's so many that Matlab chooses not to print out the full list here. But it's, again, a lexicographically sorted list of the unique column labels. These are the different values that we have. So this is, you remember we had an order column, which is 1, 2, 3, blue, green, orange, pink, silver, etc. And here, and then the overall adjacency matrix, which connects the row keys to their value keys, is 19 by 21. 19 rows by 21 columns. This actually shows a mixed use, right? Some of these are essentially exploded, right? The fact that we have each edge. But some of the values are actually storing real stuff here, blue, green, orange, etc. So you don't have to go all the way with one. You can mix them two around. You can create dense matrices that look more like traditional tables, and there's sometimes that you want to do that. And other times you can sort of completely explode it out and do things like that as well. So we go back. We just want to work with the vertices. Okay, so we're going to ignore this color and order column. So we're going to create our first projection is to just work with the vertices. So we have this little shorthand here called starts with. If you give it a character, and it will create a little query that will get just things that start with that. And very useful thing. It's very efficient too. It actually formally creates the two bounding. It figures out what the maximum range is for that, and then it just needs to look up, the beginning and the end. It can assume lexicographical order, and then it can just grab the middle. So we have a regular expression approach too, which works fine on small associative arrays, but this is much more efficient because it's just basically two lookups and go. It also works if this E was actually a binding to a table in a database. You can use the same syntax, while the regular expression syntax doesn't really work. Yes? So that's the delimiter of the string. So it's a string list with one entry in it. So this is a string list. All our strings are lists here. Well, because this also allows me. Could have been anything that was unique to that. Okay, and it didn't have to be the same delimiter that was the one inside. Could have been a new line, could have been a tab, could be whatever. I just picked comma because it was convenient, but could have been a space. Because you can have multiple arguments to the starts with. If you want to say, I want starts with this, and starts with this, and starts with this, you just give it a whole list, and it will go and do that all for you. And so that's why we do it that way. Wherever possible, we try and accept a list of strings and then do kind of the right thing. So basically this is saying get me all columns that start with V, so that will be all the vertices. And this is the colon, which says, and I want the full row of that. These had these values of, which were the order group that they were in. And so we don't care about those. We want to convert them back to regular numeric numbers. And so we have this shorthand here called double logi, which basically just takes the logical and then does the double. I think mathematically, formally, you would call this the infinity norm on strings, if that even makes sense. But it basically just says if there's a value there, convert it to a double precision 1. If there's not a value there, it's just a sparse 0. And we do this all the time because a lot of times we want to do math on these things. It's like regular math. We want to compute the vertex adjacency graph, so we do that with our square in function here, our inner square product. So that basically takes our matrix and uses the edge as the common key to join them together. And we use our display full function to actually show what we got. And so now you see the vertex adjacency matrix here. And then the number is the number of times those vertices are on the same edge. So it's obviously symmetric. And you see here some, these vertices here, which are part of this common hyperedge. We have this sort of 696 structure here, various other types of symmetric structures going on here, showing you the counts, how many times those vertices appeared on the same edge. These are obviously cliques because they are all vertices that are on the same hyperedge line. So if you have a same hyperedge line, whenever you do this squaring operation, you see it as this clique in this operation here. All right. We can also do the square out function, okay, which computes the edge adjacency matrix. So now we want to ask which edges share common vertices. And so that's this structure here. It shows you these are the various edges. And again, it's symmetric, and you can see all kinds of structures in here about which vertices which edges share common vertices. So, and that is pretty much it for this example. Very simple example. Hopefully gets you to the point where you can begin to try out the homework assignment. And if there's any questions that people have, let's try this here. One thing that's fun to do, SPY E. That's where that works. Oops. Come on, guys. I think between PowerPoint, QuickTime, and everything else, it's just about. There it is. Wow, that took a long time. So this shows that adjacency matrix So SPY works. I think I don't know if we showed that in the first example, but the SPY function is the standard Matlab sparse plotting function. Very useful way to just sort of look at the stuff, all those previous charts I showed you on the examples where we've done this thing. And a little feature that sometimes causes Matlab to crash because it doesn't really like doing things too aggressively, but if you click on it, it shows you the row and the column and the value associated with that, and also prints it out here. Likewise here. So you see row, column, that gives you the order. And this tells you, the row is G2, its column is color, its value is green. So actually, I lied to you. That was just the first example. Senior moment there. We have 2 more to go. A lot more fun. See, you're all excited the class ended early. So, all right, here's the other examples. So again, what we do is we're reading in the data set, we're displaying the full thing, so you can see there's the full beast I just showed you with the SPY plot. Now I'm going to do some analytics on this. So one thing I want to do is just get the orange edges. So I can say, get me the column color. And because orange is held in the value, I can actually compare it with the string. So I say, return me the matrix, the associative array of the row, color, and everything equal to orange. So that returns me another associative array. The result of this whole logical expression is another associative array. I can then get the rows of those associative arrays, that associative array. So now I've found all edges that are orange, and I can then get those rows and pass that back into the original one to get just the orange edges. So this just shows you sort of this composable ability that's very powerful. Same ability that Matlab has. One does similar statements in Matlab all the time, and so it's very composable. This would be a very complex query to do in other approaches, and you can do it very quickly here. Yes, question?
Would that be called to row, since it is in the row argument? Do you think it would work anyway?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. What we could do is overload it, so if you passed in an associative array with just a single argument and have it behave like when you pass in the Matlab logical and do that kind of intersection, we could think about that, but Matlab actually relies on then converting the matrix to a vector and then using the singular, basically it takes that logical, converts it to a singular index, which kind of gets us into an area where it's very fuzzy and gray. So we've definitely thought about that, and there are places where we line up with Matlab very nicely because the mathematics of associative arrays and linear algebra really line up very nicely. And there's places where they intersect. There's things you can do with associative arrays that you can't do with linear algebra. For example, we can matrix multiply any 2 associative arrays. There's no conformance requirement. They don't have the same. Normally, when you multiply 2 matrices, the dimensions the inner dimensions have to match. Basically, the columns of the left argument and the rows of the right argument must be the same length. In associative arrays, that requirement doesn't exist. You can multiply or add any 2 associative arrays. We'll get into that much more in the next class, but that's a very powerful feature that people like. But there's other places where it doesn't really make sense. So things like what is the upper triangular section of an associative array gets to be a little bit, what's that mean? So excellent question, though. Excellent question, though. So we can display this. So this just shows we found all the edges that had color orange. But we don't have to just, that's a way of using the values to select. We could have, of course, used starts with in the rows. Just say starts with O and G. I just happened to label all my rows that orange rows began with O and green rows begin with G. So we can do starts with OG. So that's an example of those 2 range queries being done at the same time. And so that gives us EOG. And again, we can see now we get the orange and green rows. So that just shows you that. And then we'll wrap up here with the last example, which is EA3. All right, now we get to do some really fun stuff. Again, we're reading in our data set, converting, just getting the vertices, okay, and then converting it to numeric zeros and ones. I'm going to now just get the orange edges, and I'm going to get the green edges. All right, and now I'm going to essentially do the cross correlation of the orange and green edges. So I'm going to transpose one of them and matrix multiply it with the other ones. We don't do square in here because they're different matrices. In fact, I would say that people often do the cross correlation more often than just square the matrix with itself. You have one set with another set, and you want to cross correlate them, a very common operation. And so that's just transpose, EVG here, and that gets that. And as you can see, the result of that inner product was empty. All right, but the result of the outer product is full. So that just, and you guys can think about why that is. And so this just shows you the common, how many edges these appeared with together. This shows you that there was no, well, you guys can figure that out. I'll let you do your homework. Now, another thing that we often want to do is basically this showed us which edges had common vertices, shared vertices together. Okay, but it didn't tell us we lost the actual vertices. We just know that there's 3, and a lot of times we want them. This is sometimes called the pedigree. You do a correlation, and then you would like, but you say these 2 things are correlated. I want to get the connector back to the original record so I can go back to my E matrix and really find that out and present that as the evidence that these things are connected together. And we don't want to lose that. So we have invented special new matrix multiplies in the land of associative arrays. One of them we call cat key mul, okay, which if you view the matrix multiply as sort of there's a key, a common key, this row column key that's being sort of joined together, well, we can preserve that and store that in the value instead of, say, the count or something like that. So we do cat key mul EV0 transpose EVG, and then when we display that, we not only see which edges were connected, but we also have preserved the list of the vertices. It's essentially a concatenated list of those keys. A very useful thing. One has to be, so very powerful technique. One definitely has to be careful about using this technique if it's going to generate extremely long lists here. That can really cause this to behave very slowly. In particular, one has to be careful of if you do a cat key mul on a matrix with itself. Why do you think you would have to be careful with that? Anyone? Remember that dense diagonal that happened whenever we squared matrices? So that means this thing will have an enormous number of entries along the diagonal. So you have to be very careful when you use this kind of function to correlate something with itself. It's better to correlate 2 distinct sets because they tend to not have that dense diagonal, which can be a little bit of a problem. There's ways to get around that. I mean, there's hacks and tricks and stuff like that. But at a certain level, really dense diagonals, I mean, you essentially be listing every single vertex in your data set. You could be listing every single vertex in your data set almost every single time, multiple times along the diagonal, and that would get very, very bulky. So just a little word of caution there. And so now I've baited you once, but this really is the end. So are there any questions on the examples before we cut it off here? Was there a question back here somewhere? No? All right, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. And again, think of a picture, draw some lines, make an incidence matrix, have fun with it. Compute the degree of your significant other. Bad idea? Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.